Well, hello, and an extremely warm welcome to my channel. My name is Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses, and a warm welcome if you're a returning viewer, and an equally warm welcome if you're viewing my channel for the very first time. So I'm feeling a bit, maudlin's not quite the right word, but I've really enjoyed doing these parallel reads of the Booker Prize Shortlist with Simon this year, and this is my final read. It's Stone Yard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. And I have to thank the lovely people at Scepter Press for sending me this, because they sent it ages ago when it first came out, knowing that I'm a Charlotte Wood fan. And I've only just got round to a point where I can read it. And I think in a way I've been putting it off because I love her writing so much. I wanted to savour it. But now I'm in a position where I have to sit and read it. So I've just read the first 20 pages or so, the first few sections. And it's being written almost in sort of diary form. You've got day 1, day 2, etc., or like a kind of countdown maybe. And so far the protagonist, whose name we don't know and maybe we never do find out, has visited her parents' graves. Very sort of interesting description of that, and particularly there seems to be a particular emphasis on sort of plastic flowers, and because we then move to some sort of convent type place, which is very near where she grew up. So this woman seems to have decided to return to an area that was very familiar to her when she was younger. And she seems to be entering some sort of retreat from the world. It's clear that she's been very successful at whatever it is she does. She seems to have a long-term relationship, which perhaps it looks as though it's broken down. She seems to be fairly clear in her mind that she's not going to be returning to that relationship. And as ever with Charlotte Wood, I just love it's just pitch perfect in terms of the sort of pace and the gradual reveal. I've got so many questions about this woman, and I'm loving her. She clearly is not religious, so it's quite interesting. I'm quite intrigued as to why she's chosen to go to this particular place to withdraw from the world. There's even a kind of sort of hint that she may be at end of life. She's certainly got back pain, but I think that could be a red herring. I'm really not sure. But obviously she's got a lot to think about, and she's dwelling a lot on bereavement. She clearly lost her parents, I think. Well, I say clearly, but I've got the impression that she lost her parents a long time ago and hasn't returned to the grave very often. In fact, she struggled to find the grave site, and she was sort of navigating with her memories of their funerals. So I think she probably hasn't been there for a long time, and clearly she really struggled after their deaths. I think they died quite close together in time. So yeah, lots of questions coming up, and a really interesting setting, and just this very calm, still, gradual revelatory style, which I'm really enjoying. And it's first person narrative, so I'm really feeling like I'm getting to know this woman in some depth. Beautifully observed. Just little things like, the references to, those little sachets of tea and coffee and things you get when you go to a hotel, and she's sort of, that's what she's been provided with in this place, and she's sort of making connections with holidays as a child and things like that. So I think there's going to be an awful lot to enjoy in this novel, and I don't feel, certainly at the moment, that it's going to disappoint at all. I'm really looking forward to reading more. Take care, and I will see you when I am about halfway through.
Hey everyone, I am in a hotel debating whether I want a more neutral life, and I'm not sure, maybe I do, but I'm actually here to tell you about my thoughts on the first 20 pages of my reread of Stone Yard Devotional. And I'm really glad that I'm rereading this, because the first time I read it, because I love Charlotte Wood so much and because I was so excited about this book, I sort of just inhaled it. And I had forgotten that the beginning part of the book is done in days. So I've just read day 1 and 2. And we meet our narrator, who has come to escape from it all by going to stay on a retreat at a nunnery. And on the way, she goes to see her parents' graves, who she hasn't visited for quite some time. And there's it's this kind of instant feeling, and it's giving me sort of tingles in a cold way, of this fine line between grief and guilt. And I think it's something that we don't often talk. I don't think we talk about grief enough, and grief is very much laced in the first 20 pages of this book. And also the sort of guilt we feel about not necessarily going to visit those of our family or friends, potentially, who have sadly died, and the sort of guilt that brings of leaving people behind, almost, or like making you feel like you, or making you worry that they might think you've forgotten them, even though they've possibly got no concept of that. I mean, this is set in a nunnery, so there is that sort of thing going on, I think, about belief in a way, but we'll come more to that later, probably once I've read more of it, because I shouldn't be coming at this from when I last read it. I should be coming at it when I'm reading it this time. Anyway, but yeah, the way that Charlotte Wood, through very subtle moments, describes both the grief and the guilt, but also the fact that we do move on, and there's a lot about moving on in this book already. We know this woman has probably left her husband, and there's a line where she says, and he's probably quite grateful for it, like she's not followed him somewhere, she's gone elsewhere. And so you've got all of this going on, and kind of you're getting these snippets of this woman's life before she parks outside the nunnery and then goes and starts joining in with what's going on at the nunnery. She's not becoming a nun, but she does go and do I've forgotten, Vespers, for example. And so yeah, I it's a really quiet yet evocative and quite haunting with the grief and guilt already read, and I've forgotten how quickly that sort of comes to the fore. There's a line I loved, found it here, that I think shows how great Charlotte Wood's writing is. As she says, "The silence is so thick, it makes me feel wealthy." I mean, that's just, ooh. So yeah, I delight in her words, frankly, and I think she's an incredible writer, and I think the way that you're just slowly drawn in and sort of almost, I'm not judging the narrator in a bad way, but I think because as we get to know her so early on, and she's giving us sort of this insight into someone who hasn't visited her parents' grave for a while, may have left her husband, could possibly be on the brink of like a breakdown, you're sort of drawn in, but also, I don't know, there's something quite engaging in an odd way, but good way, about that. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Anyway, that's where we're at. I shall catch up with you probably when I'm back home, about halfway through, as I've got a train journey and stuff. So yeah, that's my thoughts so far. Just thrilled to be back and feeling like, yeah, as I said, really glad to be rereading this, because I did sort of just inhale it the first time that I read it. So I'm going to take this at a nice leisurely pace, although it's quite short and big font. You know I love a big font. So yeah, it is a book that you can sort of, I don't want to say gallop through, you can run through like mice. There's some foreshadowing I shouldn't have mentioned. Naughty me.
So I am now about halfway through Stone Yard Devotional, and I'm just off to Oxford on the train. So I'm probably not going to take it with me, because I don't think it's enough to keep me going. I'm going to have to take another book, because I don't like to run out of bookage. But I thought I'd just report back on it and then pick it up hopefully tonight when I get home. I'm really thoroughly enjoying it. I'm completely immersed in this world. It's not described as a convent. It's, one of the nuns calls it a monastery. Some time has elapsed, and our protagonist has returned and has taken up residence there. And we're gradually getting to know more about her and more about her past. And I love the way that the little nuggets about what shaped her as a personality are being dripped into the narrative of everyday life in this, amongst this group of religious women. And the sort of, the observations very early on in the novel, when she first goes there, and I keep calling her she because as far as I'm aware, unless I've missed it, we haven't been given a name. She's anonymous, which I really quite like, but that makes it quite hard to talk about her. But very early on in the novel, she makes some comment about how, you know, the nuns, they come into the church and they do their services and they do their jobs, their chores, all very calm. You know, there's very little rufflement. That's not a word that she uses. Or disagreement. You know, there's accord between them as they go about their daily business. And she observes this and she thinks, well, in any other group of women, that wouldn't be the case. And she's speculating about what the relationships might really be and whether they sort of argue or bicker or whatever, you know, in at certain points in the day. And of course, now she's living amongst them, some time's elapsed and she's living amongst them, she's starting to get to the bottom of that a bit more. And I'm really enjoying that. The idea, it takes me back to the natural way of things, where you had a group of women living in a remote place, and Charlotte Wood was observing how they would interact with each other. There's also this a sort of second take on grief as well. So the protagonist is grieving for her mother, particularly, and she does address why her mother more than her father. But also, and it's not recent grief, it's grief that's re-emerging or that she's never dealt with. But also there is a nun whose bones are going to be returned to the place. And the sort of build up, again, it's another kind of countdown like it was at the beginning. You feel like you're counting down to the day that these bones are going to emerge at the convent. And there is a story there that we've been told about the nun whose bones they are. But I think there's more of a story. I think that there are these little teasers that we're perhaps going to find out even more. There's definitely, because these bones their arrival is so highly anticipated, it's clear that they mean more than they appear to mean on the surface to these nuns. So I suppose this is a novel about what lies on the surface, what's underneath everything. When we're in a community, you know, what can be said and what can't be said, and also sort of unpicking histories. This idea that these women have got a history that went back way before our protagonist arrived. There's also a novice nun, or at least she's a novice in the first section, and that's quite interesting, looking at her, so, you know, as time moves forward, and how being in the monastery affects her. I'm calling it a monastery because that's what it's being referred to as when it is referred to. The other thing that's really tease making as well is that although she's gone back to the area where she grew up, she's only recognised one person, and she had to introduce herself to make herself known to that person. So it's almost like she never lived there, but clearly she grew up there. And it seems like quite a rural community. So I don't know whether it's a thing or not, but I'm personally quite intrigued as to why nobody seems to recognise her. She mentions it herself. It's as if she sort of feels that people ought to recognise her, but nobody does. And I'm also getting more and more interested in the character of her mother, because we're learning a lot more about her, particularly her relationship with land, and she's a really keen gardener. And actually that's the role that the protagonist has taken in the community as well. So yeah, I'm really, really enjoying it. And again, I think it's a book in a certain league, and it absolutely deserves, as far as I can see so far, to be on the Booker shortlist. Yeah, really enjoying it, and I'm going to enjoy my day in Oxford, but I shall be looking forward to coming home and hopefully finishing it before tomorrow morning. So I'll speak to you then. Bye.
I am halfway through Stone Yard Devotional, well, just over halfway through, and I'm loving it even more than when I first read it, partly because, as I mentioned, I sort of inhaled it I'm not using the term consumed. I hate the term consumed that's being used all over the internet at the moment. Anyway, moving on. This time I'm taking it at a slower pace, even though I kind of keep wanting to go forward, because whilst it's not the plottiest of books, there's definitely a real drive to it, because there's kind of a couple of, well, there's definitely a mystery. There's the mice issue, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit more, but it has got this propulsion to read more. And there's lots of things going on in here that I think are really done amazingly. So one of the things is about outsiders, and how initially our narrator is an outsider to this nunnery / commune and has become an insider, but is still an outsider, and she feels that they're an outsider to society in a lot of ways. And there's a bit about how previously in the hometown, when people moved in with like I don't know if it was this nunnery, they were called the Moonies, and people were really suspicious of them. And again, the outsider thing is there. Plus, we find out about a young girl who was bullied before. She was deemed an outsider, even though she was from the area, but she was outside what the other children sort of, I don't know, deemed as being okay. And there's a lot through that about guilt and shame of the things that we've done in the past. So in the book earlier, we see our narrator is guilty that they haven't visited their parents' graves for a long time. And actually, one thing that I forgot to mention is how this book shifts. So at the beginning, it's like a diary, and then we discovered that our narrator has been to this sort of retreat, as it were, a few times, and then at one point has just not left, and instead of driving to the guest house, has driven straight to where the nuns are. And so there's a lot of looking back at guilt in different ways, shame in different ways. It is making me think both of when I was bullied really badly at school, not to get the violins out, but I really, really was. And there's an uncomfortable feeling there, but also it's making me look back at times when I did not great things, and how years later I still will have a sudden memory and feel a sudden sense of real shame or embarrassment or guilt about behaviours that I had as a child. And yet this book also looks at how we carry them on, because our narrator is saying, that basically she feels incredibly bad for what she's done, particularly in regard to one woman who has come back into her life. Well, has been back in her life before, but has come back again, this very infamous celebrity nun. And it's, she's judging the other nuns. She's not a nun, but she's judging the nuns that surround her just as much as they're judging her. And I'm just finding all that so interesting, because it's about judgment and presumptions. It's about guilt. It's about shame. It's about misunderstanding a lot. And going back to childhood, this book really looks at how when we're kids, we certainly don't know everything. We think we do, and we behave in a certain way, and like there can be group mentality, but also it looks at how we never really know our parents as kids, and we only see them as, our parents, obviously. As we get older, we start to both see we start to see their foibles and as well as their strengths, their weaknesses, but also how we occasionally learn about what they have been through that we aren't aware of, that made them who they were as our parents from birth, and what the repercussions and ripples of that are. Honestly, there's so much going on that this is making me think about. Definitely that guilt and shame comes to the fore. We're getting snapshots of our narrator's childhood, as I said. There's also, and this is one of my, it sounds awful to say favourites, because it's really, really gross. There's an infestation of mice. And what I think is brilliant about this book is nature very much is in the background, but it's pretty much continually both almost like what we're doing to nature, but also how much we need nature and how often we kind of ignore nature. There's a brilliant scene with a piano. If you read it, you'll know what I mean. I thought that was fantastically done. This infestation, as well as there's like this plague of mice, as well as there's also in the background a pandemic going on. And I can't work out whether this book is meant to be set sort of now, or when the pandemic was on, or actually possibly a little bit into the future. And the more I read it, the more I think maybe that. But you do get these glimpses, like planes aren't flying very often and people are wearing masks. And there's one point where, the supplies are shorter than usual, so they're having to really look at what they're growing themselves, which with the mice infestation isn't great. But there's definitely an unflinching look at human nature and an unflinching look at nature, which I also love in here. So there's loads in here, and the cover is really significant. I hadn't spotted this line, but I really loved it, and I'm going to read it to you now. Well, it's paragraph. When I think about the phases of my life, it's as a series of rooms behind me, each with the door to a previous room left open, behind which is another room and another and another. The rooms are not quite empty, not exactly dark, but they are shadowy, with indistinct shapes, and I don't like to think about them much. When I hear the name Helen Parry, I think of those rooms furthest back in the deeper shadows. And Helen Parry is, well, a name from our narrator's childhood that is now coming back to the fore as she is this celebrity nun who's also bringing back the bones of a nun who left Sister Jenny many years ago and was murdered. And there's also this returning to home is a big theme. Obviously with the narrator turning to the place that they lived when they were younger, then you've got these bones returning to the women who she spent a lot of time with, people, memories returning from our past. Yeah, I've talked for a really long time, but that's because there's so much in this book. I'm going to go now, and I will catch up with you when I have
I finished Stone Yard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. Don't know why I've had to say the author's name at this stage in the video, never mind. And thoroughly enjoyed it. There was a lot of anticipation for this novel for me because Simon had raved about it. I'd heard lots of things about it online. I love Charlotte Wood's 2 other novels that I've read. And so there was a certain amount, there's always a bit of a concern then that it might be an anticlimax. And it really wasn't. It's one of those books that I know I'll keep thinking about for a long time afterwards. I don't think I'll ever be able to think about mice again. The way that the mice, there's a plague of mice, and I don't think I'm giving anything away there because it's mentioned in the blurb, that come to this convent / religious place, and the mice just gradually there's more and more and more and more of them because it's a plague, and just the descriptions of the places the mice infiltrate and the way that they sort of start to initially disturb the women, but then they sort of get used to disposing of them. I mean, the quantities of them and the volume are quite scary. And actually, there was something really sort of surreal about that. But obviously it's not surreal. It could happen. And I don't think it's a particularly... well, it is an important thread in this novel, the whole issue of nature and the environment, partly because of the setting, but also because the main character had worked with conserving animals. So the idea that they're then sort of flooded with all these mice and she is struggling to deal with that and cope with that, I found really interesting, because you've got the converse of preservation there. You've got an animal which is taking over. There's a glut. So I found that fascinating. I also loved the whole issue to do with bones and remains and how they connect with memory, and what do you do with... There is a dilemma now. It's not straightforward, is it? Somebody dies, if you're religious or whatever, they're buried in a churchyard or they're cremated, but then what do you do with the ashes? I think as a sort of contemporary society, which is, in this part of the world anyway, less sacred, or less religious, this whole idea of what to do with someone's mortal remains, I think is really interesting. So that whole sort of presence of the bones and the way that they treat those bones, I found deeply fascinating. And I think there's a lot in here about how you remember people, how you acknowledge the lives of those who have died before you. and obviously that's played out very much in her thoughts about her own mother. And I like the way that gradually, as you read the novel, you get to know a bit more about her mother. Her mother becomes more of a sort of real person or a personality. But I think the thing I love most about this book was the character of Helen Parry, who is somebody that the narrator has known at school, who appears at this religious place in connection with the return of these bones. And she's a real sort of enigma. There's a certain amount of disapproval of her amongst the women. And certainly the narrator, there's a lot of disquiet about her presence. And it's the way it sort of reignites the discomfort of being a young woman, a child at school, and the way that we treat our peers and the way that our peers treat us, and how we navigate those relationships, but we don't necessarily get it right even in adulthood. And also Helen Parry's relationship with her mother as well. The way that is explored in the novel, I found deeply interesting, and I liked the resolution of that as well. I'm trying to be careful again so I don't give too much away. So I think this is again, it's a very slight book, like a lot of the books on this list, but boy, does it pack a punch, and there is so much that it leaves you thinking about, about the way that you... I am a really, really big believer in forgiveness. I think there isn't enough of it. It's so easy to fall out with people, particularly people you love. It's so easy to destroy important relationships, and all it takes is forgiveness on both sides to... And I say all because it's not an easy thing to achieve, but that whole sense of forgiveness and atonement and all those sorts of things is something that really fascinates me. I think also because of my love for the Iliad. I think one of the reasons that I love the Iliad, and this is a bit of an aside, I suppose, but it's actually really important, is because there is a scene in the Iliad where King Priam goes to retrieve the body of his son from the hands of the man who has killed him, and that scene has always, for some reason, been so important in my intellectual life. And I think I go back to it over and over again. I think it teaches me a lot about how the world might be a better place if we could learn to forgive a bit easier, and maybe it's a very naive viewpoint, I know, but maybe the world, a lot of the atrocities that happen, particularly war, would if people could just get around a table and talk and actually realise that we're all equal, we're all human, maybe it would help. Anyway, I digress. So yes, this book has really meant a lot to me.
Hey everyone, I have now finished my reread of Stone Yard Devotional, and I just think this book is so incredible, and even so more on a reread. I've been umming and ahhing whether this is about to be my rereading era, but rereading sort of terrifies me in the fact that there's so many books that I've read that I'd like to reread, sort of, but I wouldn't want them to be ruined, and thankfully this one wasn't. But also I'm always a bit like, oh my goodness, there's so many books I still haven't read yet. Anyway, that's probably for another time. So the final, without giving any spoilers away, the final, particularly third part of the book, after there is kind of a bit of a reveal, I guess, is very much around, well, some of the darkest parts of life, if I'm honest. It looks at murder, it looks at terminal illness, and dying, and it does so in this incredibly raw way. As someone who helped look after my grandparents when they were both terminally ill, the way that Charlotte Wood writes about that experience of looking after anyone with a terminal illness, be it a friend, be it your parent, be it your grandparent, whoever, the way that she looks at that, I think, is quite, like I said, raw, incredibly deft, and does kind of, it asks the questions like, not what is the point of life, but kind of like, what is the point of life, if you know what I mean, and how we have to sort of, I don't know, whether it's about living for the people, or it just looks at it in a very unflinching way. And I'm still thinking about that. I mean, it links into the grief that she writes about earlier, but also that's the other thing that brings up with dying, or with other people dying as well. So it can go either way. It's forgiveness, and people looking to be forgiven for things they've done when they know someone is dying, or as they're dying, looking to be forgiven or to forgive others. And there's big questions around that Charlotte Wood looks at here with this book. I think, as I mentioned before, there is this sort of nod at parenthood. I will say it definitely becomes more about the relationships between mothers and their children as the book goes on. Also, the religion that's kind of been, I mean, constantly there in the background, because this is set in a nunnery, that very much comes more to the fore. And I think the way Charlotte Wood looks at religion and the benefits of belief, but also the questions around belief, and the questions around, you know, Jesus saves and all of that, that's really interestingly interrogated, I think, here. And what I will say is, throughout the whole book, there's this real balance of looking at things from both sides. It's never in any way like suggesting or leaning towards anything particular. I think that's what I do really like, is that Charlotte Wood is investigating all of these things: religion, grief, belief, forgiveness, guilt, shame. It's so much in here. And also, whilst I know people have said that this isn't the most plotty book, there is so much in here, because as I said, like in the final third, we look at murder, we look at people with terminal illnesses. So there's big themes in here that, because of the stories that they bring in around either our narrator's past or other sisters within, or the sisters, actually not other sisters because she's not a sister, but you know what I mean, that well, if you've not read it, you won't know what I mean, but hopefully if you haven't read it yet, you'll want to read it because it's so good. There's just so much going on in this book. It's very much a book of ideas and questions, and you don't always get the answers. Sometimes you have to think about it, and it's your take on the world, and that's what you're bringing to any book anyway. But I feel like there's an added layer with this book of that. So yeah, I just thought it was phenomenal on a second read, and has reminded me again how much I love Charlotte Wood's writing, and the fact that I have got quite a lot of her backlist books on my shelves, including one of her non-fiction books. And it is non-fiction November, so maybe it's time for me to head to that this month, actually. But there we go. I'm hoping Mum has loved it as much as I have. I'm hoping she's got as much out of it as well. I think there'll be certain parts that will really chime with her, particularly around the death of, or terminal illness, and the death of parents, but also just dying, and also the way this book really does interrogate all parts of life. There's also a part in here that I should mention where Charlotte Wood looks at, when they're at the hospital, there's an area that's named after the Aboriginal land on which it's on, and that becomes quite a poignant moment, and also looks back to some shame, and there's immigration thrown in here. And I also should say it's a book about climate crisis in a lot of ways. I mentioned nature. Our narrator's job is within protected or around protecting the earth. So there's so many things in here, and yet it's done so deftly, and it's so readable, because like I said before, there's this real propulsion to it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this. I think it is an incredible book, and yeah, I will next see you to talk about the book of books when me and Mum do our shortlist ranking and winner predictions video. I don't know how that's going to go. That's going to be very interesting, but I shall go myself now because I talked for too long. But yeah, love to know your thoughts on this book. Can't wait to find out Mum's thoughts on this book. And that's that. Bye.
That's the final read for this series that Simon and I have done on the Booker Prize shortlist, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I know that we're meeting together to discuss our rank orders and to choose our winners together. as if we were a judging panel of two in a week or two, and I'm really looking forward to that discussion with him, because I think there might be some interesting haggling, and I still haven't got a settled hierarchy yet. I need to mull these books over a bit more before I get to that point. Anyway, happy reading, everyone. If you have read this book or any of the other books on the Booker shortlist, please let me know what you thought. Comments down below. Take care, everyone. Bye.